Good morning. Today is Wednesday, August the 26th. Yesterday we talked about our need for our own personal rebuilding project. At this time, with all of the stuff that's going on, especially with the isolation that we've been going through, a lot of people are asking themselves what they really want their lives to be. When we emerge from all of this, what direction do they want their lives to be taking? It's very interesting because a lot of people are very serious right now that perhaps have just been kind of putting things off in the past. So it's a good time to ask, what do we want our lives to be? And what's it going to take for us to get there? We talked about the need for each of us to pray, to do that course correction that's necessary to guide us back towards what we're supposed to be in the eyes of God, and for all of us to focus on Christ likeness as our goal. But the next steps can be very, very personal and therefore difficult. It requires some real honesty on our part. Honesty to God, honesty to ourselves. I'm reminded of the Psalms, many of the Psalms, particularly the lamenting Psalms. There are 40 of them, wherein the writer of the psalm is acknowledging their own shortcomings in some way so that they can have a restored spiritual relationship with God. Nehemiah, when he was getting ready to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem, the very first thing that he did was to go to God and acknowledge how they as a nation had failed God's will. And so in this rebuilding project, the right thing to do is to take a very close look, an honest look at where we are and what we're all about. Again, I'm reminded of the prodigal son. He realized how unhappy he was as a result of following his own poor choices along the way, so he set about to figure out what needed to be done. So we ask this question: how can you tell if you have a spiritual illness? You know, there are spiritual illnesses that show no symptoms, and those are perhaps the most frightening, because if we don't see a spiritual symptom in our life, then certainly we don't do anything about it. If I have a very serious physical pain in my body, I do something about it. The body is designed that way. Well, our soul is designed to experience some indicators when we are spiritually off track. But if we have learned to ignore them, if we have allowed our conscience to be seared, then indeed we may be in deep trouble, and we may not ever realize how serious the problem was unless someone comes along to show us, or when we stand before God in judgment. So we ask these questions and we look, what are the indicators of a spiritual illness within our lives? Let me give you a few things to look at. First of all, are you a person of peace? When your friends think about you, do they see you at peace? Are you a person who shares a peaceful life with others? Or are you constantly worried about something? Are you always anxious about something and experiencing this anxiety? Now, there can be lots of reasons for this, but one of the reasons is a spiritual reason. We don't have things right with God, and therefore the rest of our life is thrown off balance. Maybe we're feeling guilty about something. This is certainly an outward indicator of a spiritual problem. We've done something wrong and we feel bad about it. It is certainly time to identify where that guilt's coming from and what needs to be done to remedy that situation. Maybe we feel shame. Shame is so painful. Shame makes us want to go and hide. It makes us want to just ignore the fact that we had this terrible problem and we wish it would just go away. But shame is there and it's real. And it means that we have a spiritual problem that needs to be fixed. Maybe you are experiencing some spiritual nudges along the way. There is something or some things that you know you ought to be doing and you're not. And yet there are these little nudges that life keeps giving you, pushing you in the direction of doing that thing. Well, that's a sign of a spiritual dilemma that needs to be dealt with. All of these things, I suppose, fall under the big umbrella of conscience. You have a conscience because God gave you a conscience. And that conscience is there to help you be sensitive to your own shortcomings. And then finally, one more thing. What about anger? Are you angry? What are you angry at? What triggers that anger? Never in our lives have we lived in a world that is more angry than our world is right now. And yet, as Christians, that's not the path that we're to be walking down. Often, anger is an indicator that there is something spiritually wrong within us. Oh, we may be angry at someone else. We may even be angry at God. But it is an indicator that there is something going on deep inside that we need to confront. And therefore, I would urge you, if you are angry, do have this long, serious talk with yourself. Figure out, what is it you're angry at so that you can do something about it. All of these things reveal the spiritual illnesses that are within us that truly eat us up from the inside out. Once you have given thought, once you have maybe talked about these things to a trusted friend, certainly after you've prayed about these things, at that point, you are more prepared to make the repairs that need to be made in your spiritual life, in this personal rebuilding project that we're talking about. But even at this point, we may be confronted with something that's really hard. Whatever it is that's been causing all of this spiritual problem, it may call for us to forgive. Forgiveness is hard. Occasionally I'll hear somebody say something like, well, I just have a hard time saying I'm sorry. Well, of course you do. We all do. Because that requires some humility. It requires us to be honest with self and with others. Forgiving is sometimes just, it seems like the hardest thing to do. But sometimes the problem comes along and we can feel justified in not forgiving because that person who has done something against us, they never ask for forgiveness. Sometimes they don't even care if we forgive them. Or maybe sometimes that person is no longer even a part of our lives, and yet we hold on to the anger that's eating us up. God knew that for us to forgive someone is not primarily for the person who needs to be forgiven, but for the person who needs to forgive. Regardless of what that other person does, how they react, or even if they ignore what they have done, our own response can spiritually kill us. And therefore we need to forgive. A few very notable examples of forgiveness have made the news, even the national news recently. Not long ago in Texas, the police broke into the apartment of a completely innocent man, a spiritual brother in Christ, as a matter of fact, broke into his apartment, and in the ensuing chaos, the man was killed. And yet the family of that man chose to publicly forgive rather than to carry the hate and the anger that they might have been expected to carry around. Indeed, it would have been politically expedient for them to hang on to their anger, but they chose not to do it because forgiving was the Christ-like thing to do. And in this project of ours that we're rebuilding, don't forget to forgive yourself. If God has the power to forgive you, then you should have the power to forgive yourself. If you don't forgive yourself of what God has forgiven you, then you are saying to God that His perspective doesn't matter, that He doesn't know enough, that He is not insightful enough to really know what's going on. And indeed, we know better than that. We need to forgive self so that we can move on. In this rebuilding project of you, don't let anything consume you from the inside. Forgive. Let the character of Christ guide you. He forgave those who were crucifying Him, so we can forgive those who have hurt us. So here we are. We've seen the problem in our life. We've chosen to make the correction to that problem, and we've taken those first steps of repairing that brokenness. Now, it is time to see something very interesting. It's time to see how God handles this and to let God do what He does. He directs, He strengthens, He equips. We'll talk about this tomorrow.